There have been ongoing assessments that Iran can't hold out much longer, but Iran is still holding on to this day. In fact, some analyses suggest that its military strength remains more intact than expected. China recently imported about 9 trillion won in crude oil. Let's examine the situation further. The United States and Iran were unable to maintain a ceasefire agreement, and the conflict has lasted over 140 days. Recently, as the clashes between the United States and Iran continue, Iran even attacked a US military base in Jordan, resulting in 2 American soldiers killed and 1 missing. So far, a total of 16 US soldiers have been killed, and more than 430 have been injured. Iran has also demonstrated to the world that it is still capable of continuing the war. In the early war, Ali Khamenei and regime leaders suffered heavy losses and appeared shaken. Now, Iran uses the Strait of Hormuz as leverage and employs asymmetric strategies to effectively continue its war with the United States. According to a recent report by the New York Times in the United States, Iran's recent attack targeting US troops stationed in Jordan has shown that Iran still has a sufficient stockpile of missiles and has also improved its ability to evade US air defense systems. This time, President Trump said in an interview with Fox News that the weapon capabilities of Iran's Revolutionary Guard have decreased by 90% and that their main forces, especially drones, missiles, and launchers, have suffered significant damage. He also said that even if a full-scale war breaks out, it is now impossible for Iran to respond with anything beyond guerrilla-style attacks on merchant ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Even if a full-scale war erupts, Iran can only respond with guerrilla attacks on merchant ships in the Strait of Hormuz. The British Guardian, citing leaked US intelligence, reported differently than President Trump. According to that assessment, as of last May, Iran had maintained about 70% of its missile stockpiles and launchers compared to before the war, and it was found that out of 33 missile launch sites around the Strait of Hormuz, 30 had been restored. Despite prolonged airstrikes by the United States and Israel, there are suggestions that they may have failed to completely eliminate Iran's core missile capabilities. In particular, there is also analysis that Iran has been able to continuously maintain its missile attack capabilities, as underground facilities and dispersed launch sites have been restored at a faster rate than expected. This assessment is getting attention because it differs from the United States' public explanations. Also, Iran's attack methods are quite sophisticated. Iran has consistently used the tactic of launching cheap drones multiple times before resorting to many ballistic missiles. Air defense networks must intercept every target, so frequent drone attacks quickly deplete interceptor missiles and detection resources. After continuously pressuring the opponent's defensive capabilities like this, they wait for the moment when the air defense network's response capacity drops, and then launch ballistic missiles. They mentioned the possibility that such tactics may have actually appeared on the battlefield. They also reported the Jordanian airbase in Jordan, where US troops were killed, was attacked 4 times in 5 days. Dozens of American soldiers were injured and several helicopters damaged during this process. Given these circumstances, repeated drone attacks may have strained the air defense system, preventing it from fully stopping the later ballistic missile attack. Despite the United States' overwhelming military power, Iran has lasted over 140 days because both sides have fundamentally different goals. For the US, military superiority doesn't end the mission. They must ensure the safety of all civilian vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz and create an environment where international oil transport can continue without interruption. Additionally, the United States must defend the ports, refineries, storage, military bases, and energy infrastructure of its Middle Eastern allies. Achieving these goals requires deploying various assets long-term, such as carrier strike groups, refueling tankers, early warning aircraft, air defense systems, and maritime patrol forces. For an extended time, if the defense weakens in any area, Iran may exploit it, forcing the United States to manage a vast region at once. Iran, meanwhile, has more realistic goals and doesn't need to fully blockade the Strait of Hormuz or attack all ships. By intermittently threatening with drones, cruise missiles, mines, and fast boats, they can achieve significant results just by creating the perception that merchant ships or oil tankers are not safe. The shipping industry may change routes, suspend operations, or face higher insurance premiums if risks rise. These changes affect international crude oil transportation costs and supply chains, so from Iran's perspective, even limited military actions can yield significant strategic effects. In addition, Iran has reorganized its military structure over a long period to match its ability to sustain war. Iran studied how the US and Israel used leadership targeting and command network disruption in Iraq and Afghanistan, and has considered the possibility of facing similar tactics themselves. Therefore, they focused on decentralizing the command structure into multiple layers and building a system where even if senior commanders are eliminated, their successors can immediately take over the mission. They also expanded the independent decision-making authority of field commanders so that operations can continue even if contact with higher command is lost. In such a structure, removing top leaders doesn't immediately weaken the military's operations. So even if the US and Israel target leaders, Iran's military can keep fighting with the rest of the organization, and their resolve remains strong. In addition, there is news that could be a burden for the United States. After the US ended its maritime blockade on Iran, Iran exported up to $6 billion worth of crude oil to China in 1 month, equal to about 8.94 trillion won. This means that Iran, which was facing great difficulties due to war and economic sanctions, was able to secure a large amount of foreign currency in a short period of time. The Wall Street Journal reports that about 10 days after the US lifted the blockade, around 20 Iranian oil tankers began heading to Malaysia's east coast. However, this was not their final destination. It was found that the ships used a so-called ship-to-ship transfer method, moving the crude oil to other tankers in waters about 70 kilometers off the coast of Johor, Malaysia. It is believed that the crude oil, which changed its transportation route in this way, was then sent to the teapot refineries, which are small private refineries located in Shandong Province, China. This method makes the movement of crude oil more complicated, making it harder to track. China has already established itself as the largest buyer of Iranian crude oil. AP News reported that China buys about 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, and at the center of this are not state-owned refineries, but small private refineries known as teapots. Large state-owned enterprises and major banks in China are closely connected to the US financial system, so they have to consider the risk of sanctions. However, relatively smaller private refineries face fewer of these restrictions. As a result, Iranian crude oil is still mainly traded through these companies. The Wall Street Journal said this major oil export has greatly helped Iran's economy. Despite higher costs from military operations and sanctions, Iran has managed to maintain government finances and continue military activities by earning foreign currency from large-scale oil sales. From the US perspective, the burden is bound to grow because efforts to cut off Iran's funding through economic pressure are not working as quickly as hoped. The New York Times assessed that in the recently resumed second round, the United States' strategy has not yet become clear. Although the United States continues its offensives, airstrikes, and naval blockades, there is no consistent blueprint for when and how to bring Iran to the negotiating table. Looking back at the first round of war before the previous ceasefire agreement, one important fact has emerged. The Iranian Navy was heavily damaged, but its control of the Strait of Hormuz remained stronger than expected. Even though Iran's naval power was reduced, the environment in which ships passing through the strait and neighboring countries had to stay on edge continued unchanged, which was different from what the United States had expected. For this reason, the New York Times suggested that this time, the United States may be adjusting its strategy to directly undermine the foundations of control over the Strait of Hormuz, rather than just targeting the Iranian Navy. Kharg Island is being mentioned again in the process. Kharg Island is known as a key hub for Iran's oil exports, and there has been ongoing analysis that seizing or paralyzing its functions could directly damage Iran's economy. However, this operation also carries significant risks. Previously, the US military considered occupying Kharg Island, but abandoned the plans over concerns about heavy casualties. There could be casualties during the landing operation itself, and after occupation, continuous defensive forces would need to be maintained. Since Iran also recognizes this area as a strategic stronghold, it is highly likely that they would put up strong resistance. Does the US government believe time favors them? If the maritime blockade tightens, Iran's crude oil exports and foreign currency income will fall, increasing economic pressure over time. However, the New York Times noted that this war's outcome isn't decided solely by military power. The analysis is that a key variable in this confrontation is which side can endure longer: the Trump administration, which faces political pressure due to rising oil prices, or the Iranian leadership, which is under financial pressure from reduced oil exports. As the war continues, rising costs for both sides make it likely that not just military clashes, but also staying power across the economy, politics, and public opinion will shape the outcome.